Hey guys, welcome to this edition, I suppose. Are we calling it that now?
Yeah, can.
I'm here with Dan and Abel, who are
Hello.
going to talk us through the passage for last Sunday, which was from John chapter 21, verse 18 till the end. But perhaps before we jump into the passage, Dan, could you give us a short overview of what's happened before?
Yeah, so this is one of the key stories that of Peter and the disciples, but really focuses on Peter meeting Jesus after the resurrection. And we're looking at that now because obviously we're between Easter and moving towards Pentecost. And really, the key thing of this passage focuses on is that Peter has failed. He's failed Jesus, and this is Jesus finding Peter, who's gone back to doing what he was doing before, fishing, and he makes him known that he's forgiven for his past, but also that he reinstates his calling. And so that's what we looked at before. Jesus deals with his past, the afterwards, his failure to follow Jesus, but also here his failure to catch fish. And then he reinstates him. He speaks to him about his past, speaks to him about what's going on in the present, but also, and then the big challenge says, "Do you love me?" And Peter replies 3 times that he loves Jesus. And that's kind of the key qualification to be a follower of Jesus is, do you love me? That's the key question. But then having spoken to Peter about his past, he then turns his attention on speaking to Peter about his future. And that's what we're going to look at and what Jesus speaks on from verse 18 onwards.
Okay, great. So before we discuss, if you guys have the passage in front of you, it would be useful. Have a read, take some time to read, then ask yourself these 3 things. So is there anything that stood out? Is there any questions that you have first? Is there anything that stood out? And is there anything from there that you could apply?
Now.
Now.
Like that's the arrow, right? Pointing downwards. It means now.
Now.
Yeah, now.
Or in the
Near future.
near future, yeah.
Okay,
Can.
let's
Also
go.
can.
Okay, great. So Dan, could you kick us off and tell us?
Okay, so let's just go through a bit line by line. So Jesus speaks to Peter and says this, "Very truly I tell you." In other words, saying pay attention. Whenever you see something sort of redundancy means excessiveness. So very truly means like pay attention, Peter, in a world of things trying to grab our attention, like do this immediately if you have diabetes or what. This is like pay attention to this stuff. This is going to be important. And he says this to him. "When you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you're older, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go."
That almost sounds grim.
Yeah, it's pretty grim. In fact, he says, to make it clear, Jesus says to him, this will indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. So he's speaking to Peter about his future, so he can know his future secure. But he's sort of telling him about the sort of, at face value, the things that look negative, but as you look at them more, are actually quite freeing. So the first here is that your scope will decrease in life, which is sort of like not what we kind of assume. We kind
Not
of
exactly
think,
sexy.
yeah, we kind of think that as we go forward, as we mature, we'll have more and more options. But what Jesus here is saying, actually the scope of your life will decrease. It's going to get smaller. And that's really sort of countercultural here, because in the world today, we tend to think of our destiny in terms of infinite options. But really, we kind of know this. It's sort of, that to choose one thing means to not to choose other things. And really where I think the good news is here is that Jesus is saying, well, what I've got for you is better than what you'd get for yourself. So like reading between the lines here, he says, "Peter, when you were younger, you dressed yourself." What did Peter do the last time he dressed himself? He got dressed and jumped into the ocean like a bit of a buffoon. And you went where you wanted. Where did he go last time he went where he wanted? He went back home, back to square one. So Jesus is kind of saying, yeah, you've got loads of options, but it's not actually that fruitful. Actually, when you've got one option with Jesus, it's more fruitful than having billions of options without him.
Yeah. And you said then that we die into our learning as well. There's this sense in which as we move further into our future and follow God, we're choosing the best path, but that means that we're also not choosing other paths as well. And there's a sense in which we're dying to ourselves or dying to possible futures as well. If you like, almost giving up certain shadow lives, the lives that you never had. Maybe the guy that you could have dated, or the girl that you could have married, or the job that you could have had.
Careful.
Not very good examples there.
Awkward if you're standing next to your spouse and your boss. between your
Discuss.
boss. Yeah, discuss that with your boss and your wife. No, Mars
Could you get
said.
married?
Mars said last week, if you want to grow, you have to let go. And there's this sense that you have to let go. But Jesus, the good news here is that when you're following Jesus, although your options limit, it leads to glory.
Yeah.
It says that this is the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And there was this key thing that I mentioned, taken from a guy called Mike Todd, who spoke at the leadership conference. And I'm probably stealing a key part of his talk in advance here. But he spoke about this idea that we're often afraid that we won't fulfill our potential, but actually none of us will fulfill our potential because there are millions of things we could have done and there's just not enough time. But also, it's not what Jesus asks of us. He doesn't ask us to fulfill our potential. He asks us to be obedient.
And even Jesus didn't fulfill his potential. He could have done many things. He could have been the greatest emperor on earth in a political way. He could have stayed on and not died and ruled. He could have basically everything that was within his power, which is limitless, and yet he chose the narrow path. And you said then, a billion options without Jesus is not as fruitful as one option with Jesus.
Yeah, and you see that with Peter's life. When Peter had his options, he went back to fishing and doing what he was doing before. But the moment Jesus narrows his options, he becomes one of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen. But it means narrowing the scope of his life.
Yeah. And that's actually really interesting, and I think that's not something that we hear quite often, because like, a lot of the voices in the world is always like, go out there and fulfill your potential and be the best that you can be. And we should, and to do that, there is this narrowing of our paths. And so the first question really is to discuss that. I believe that this could probably be the first time too that many of us are hearing this kind of concept. So discuss in your small groups maybe, what do you think about the idea of not fulfilling your potential, but instead pursuing purpose and obedience towards Jesus?
Yeah, this idea, Jesus doesn't say to Peter, go fulfill your potential. He says, follow me.
This could be a bestseller then. You should write a book called How to Not Fulfill Your Potential.
Oh yeah, brilliant, great.
Okay, let's
send in your ideas to me, and I will maybe give you a credit.
Okay, let's discuss. Okay, great. So let's move on to the next thing about our future.
What's the next thing here, and it's sort of all tied up in here, is that Jesus says your future, it's secure, but it will involve challenge. So, as you said, it's a little bit grim, but he says someone else will dress you, Peter, and he'll lead you to where you do not want to go. And there's this sense that Jesus speaks to them about their future and the challenge, because he doesn't want us to think that when it gets hard, we've fallen out of the will of God, or somehow God has failed. And not just challenge, but he speaks to them about death. Because Peter, actually, history tells us he is crucified, and he is crucified upside down. It is pretty horrible. But Jesus, he's using figurative language here because he wants us to receive this at every level. It's not just the extreme. Sometimes we look at this and think, well, most of us don't get martyred. Some people do, but most of us don't. But all of us are called to die to ourselves. That's what obedience is. That's what loving somebody else is, or choosing the narrow path is dying to your wishes and trusting that Jesus will give you more than you have given up. And that's the promise. That's the shape of the Christian life, that we die to ourselves and that Jesus, by his Spirit, breathes new life into us and he resurrects us. And that's the shape, death and resurrection. And that changes our character, but it's also a promise eternally. That we will, though we die physically, we will rise again if we put our trust in Jesus.
And part of dying to yourself is to sometimes give up something. And then you said what you give up is not as great as what you will gain. There is a promise with that dying. There is that life after death. And the good news is not so much in the message, but in the messenger of that message as well.
You have to imagine the drama of this, that, this is not good news. You're going to die and it's going to hurt. Like, that's just not good news. It's saying, there's no rose tinted. It's not going, oh, it's going to be great, Peter. It's like, no, this is not where you want to go. The good news is not so much in the message as it is in the messenger. That Jesus is standing in front of Peter talking to him about death, and yet 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jesus died. And yet he is now standing very much alive in front of Peter because he has defeated death. And he's saying, your future involves challenge, but you can have hope because the challenge will not overcome you. Death is defeated. And again, it's the sense of when we follow Jesus, it's literally follow him, because When you die, you're following Jesus because he had allowed himself to die. So we're following his footsteps, and we can know that death is not the end. And it's this promise of the sure and certain hope of the resurrection from the dead. That's in the funeral liturgy. And it's this powerful line of saying, this is what we're promised in Jesus.
And there's something freeing about that, knowing that there may be challenge, but there's hope after the death. It's not a false hope where everything's going to be rosy and really nice, but life will have challenges, and there will be some things to give up, but the promise of life and the promise of the messenger is there for us.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so all this is sounding quite grim, a little bit grim, but you had a really good example, right, about your relative who's a ballet dancer.
Yeah, I mean, so on a simple level, we get this, a ballet dancer, not a belly dancer, as my poor pronunciation. Slightly different, though equally as skillful, some might say. If I cause problems there, Abel's giving me a look. Okay, so I mean, we see this everywhere. Like I was saying, my sister-in-law is a ballet dancer, and but in her contract it says she can do no extreme sports. Like if she went skiing on holiday and posted a photo, she would get fired because it's like they can't risk you getting injured doing something, having to pay for your physio. And so by choosing anything, we are choosing not lots of other things. But in Jesus, whenever you give something up, what you gain is always more. So for Peter, we see he gave up a lucrative fishing business, but what he gained was to become the leader of the movement that changed the world. But also in the eternal, he gave up a body that was perishing, and he received a body that is imperishable. That's the promise for all of us. When we die, we will be resurrected.
Great. So the next kind of question that we want you guys to discuss or share stories on is, where have you seen this principle of gaining more than losing play out? So where have you seen, either in your own life or in your friends or other people's lives, of because they chose a path towards something, they had to give up other things, but then it ended up resulting in life rather than sadness or grief or anything like that. Okay, so let's discuss. Great. So last point.
Well, this is quite humorous. John's Gospel is quite funny. There's a lot of irony here when you look. And so this bit's really encouraging to me. So Jesus says to Peter, follow me. It's in the present imperative tense. So in other words, keep following me. That you never outgrow following Jesus. To be a leader, you have to follow the leader. And so this is what Jesus says to Peter. Immediately we read, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. Like in the original language, it says, having turned, Peter saw. So having told him to follow, Peter turns. And it's like, follow, keep your eyes on me. And Peter's immediate response is to look in the opposite direction. And then the irony is he's told him to follow me, and it's the same root word for what John is doing. So John is doing what Peter is supposed to be doing, and instead of doing it, he looks at somebody else's following. There's a great quote from Spurgeon that says, I've come to the conclusion that instead of trying to set all my master's servants right at once, my first and foremost important work is to follow my Lord. And I think, my brother, that it would be wise for you to come to the same conclusion, that we'll always be tempted to compare. I love, this is a poem by T.S. Eliot, and it says this: because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope to turn, desiring this man's gift and that man's scope, I no longer strive towards such things. And you can carry on if you like poetry. It's a powerful poem sort of about Ash Wednesday, but I love that, being free from comparison, no longer striving to strive towards what other people have. And the key message here is, no matter how successful you get in life, you will always be tempted to compare. Like, think about Peter. I wrote it down somewhere here. Peter's calling had excitement, adventure, and risk. It had power, influence, and position. It had youthful success, generational impact. It reached the nations, and he got to do it with his mates, and yet he's tempted to compare. Like, this is like, if you were writing your perfect calling in life, these are all the things that you'd probably want to go for, unless you just want a quiet life with your feet up. That would be another one.
And then you'd be envious of someone else who's got a better quiet life.
Yeah, got their feet higher up, or comfier chair.
There's no escape.
But basically, there's no way of escaping envy. And envy will always be at your door. And there's this fascinating thing that psychologists have started reporting on called self-envy, where people are now like they basically are looking at the lives that they're projecting online and envying that life that they're projecting. And it's got this great line that at the end of it, we're not sure what to do with the inflatable unicorn after the Insta story is ended. But this idea that if you start envying people, it never stops. But it also doesn't lead you to what you're trying to do, because you're not called to be obedient the way John is obedient. You're called to be obedient the way Peter was obedient. This is Jesus' point. Because if you actually answer that question, it's like, well, what about him? And it's like, well, what about John? Well, John is at what Jesus could have said, John's going to write a book about me, and he's going to include all of the stupid things that you say and do, Peter. And you can guarantee that this bit is going to be in it, Peter, because it's going to be very encouraging to other people. But it's not encouraging to you, so I'm not going to tell you about that. Instead, I'm just going to say, what is it to you? You must follow me. And I think that's the thing to hear. When you start to hear yourself comparing yourself to other people, just hear Jesus saying, what is it to you that they got promoted? You follow me. What is it to you that they didn't have to suffer? You follow me. Basically, Peter's been told you're going to suffer, and so Jesus goes to the opposite extreme. What if I want him to remain alive forever? He could have said, what is it to you if John rides on a unicorn across a rainbow to Narnia? What is it to you? You follow me. There is no fruit to be found in comparison. And again, it's wonderful. Because of this, a rumor spread amongst the believers that this disciple would not die, but Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, if I wanted to remain alive, what is that to you? It's like even the early church gossiped and misunderstood. It's like the church sort of always struggles with these kind of things, because comparison will always be at your door. But the amazing thing is, God even used that that's partly why this story is here in the gospel, to set that rumor right and encourage us. The other thing, a little note here, is just this was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at supper and said, Lord, who is it going to betray you? That's John. John only asks that question because Peter asks him to ask that question. So this is a life pattern in Peter's life, that he's constantly comparing himself to other people. And Jesus is like, we're not going to talk about that. It's pointless.
Yeah. And this moment is so important because Peter's about to be released into important ministry. He's about to be the leader of the early church. And he's freed from envy, or he's challenged to be freed from envy, because then you said when you're freed from it, it allows you to play your hand. And there's a solution to envy, the envy of others, which is to envy Jesus.
Yeah.
Maybe just say a bit more about that.
I think that's why Jesus says, follow me. Take all that energy that you're using comparing yourself to other people and use it to look at Jesus. Because when you envy his closeness with the Father, his power in the Spirit, his love for people, Jesus says, well, you can have that, because everything the Father has given me, I've given to you. And it's just this wonderful sort of just wonderful thing that Jesus, as you're close to him, he gives you what you need. So he just keeps saying, keep following me. It's the same command all the way through our lives.
Great. So the last thing that we want you guys to chat about and pray for each other on is where are the places where you are tempted to compare? It's really quite a natural thing, as we read, like even Peter did, to want to compare ourselves. But it's very releasing then, as we've just discussed, to not compare and to really just kind of stay in our lanes and stay on the calling that Jesus has called us to.
And I think that word where is really important, because actually it's for different people. For some people it might be when they're by themselves but with their phone looking at social media. Other people, they're fine with that, but it might be you're in the team meeting, the decision's not going your way, and that's your sort of trigger to start comparing yourself. And therefore, and also another interesting is, well, what do you do when you start to compare? Because once you know those things, you can actually sort of spot it and then start to stop it when it comes up. Because as we said, there's no good fruit that comes from comparing yourself to other people.
Yeah. Okay, so let's discuss this question, and please do pray for each other in this area, that we'll be all released from this idea of comparison and envy.
Yeah, have a great discussion. Have a great week.
Good night.
Okay, see you guys.